So without further ado, let me introduce you to our two wonderful speakers today. So we have Ben and Clive. We're going to start with Ben. Ben's going to be talking about, why fintech is failing to win hearts and minds, and what we can do about that. Ben, a lot of you know from his time at Level39, but he's also, created and sold his own company, a crowdfunding business. So we'll be talking to Ben in just a minute. And Clive, who used to be the service design director at Barclays Bank, now currently runs the service design program at the Royal College of Art in London, and he'll be following up. So thank you both, really appreciate it. And Ben, we'll just turn it over to you, and please fire away.
Brilliant. Simon, thank you very much indeed. And ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to join you this afternoon, and I hope you're enjoying a delicious lunch. Please get stuck in, get started. Which is, I've turned to PowerPoint and hope to share with you something which illustrates this. So if you bear with me a second, I'm going to share screen. And I do this acutely conscious of the fact that I'm about to hand over to a design guru. So I'm going to ask you all simply to see this as the shocking warm-up act for what you're about to see from Clive, and tolerate with me for a few moments my attempts to illustrate the process of winning hearts and minds in fintech. So I'm going to invite you to come on a short journey. I'm going to invite you to draw out a graph like this in your minds and consider whereabouts your business or businesses that you know or care about really are. So let me just introduce you to the axes of this graph. For the sake of simplicity, you can think of the vertical axis as appealing to the mind and the horizontal axis as appealing to the heart. But you'll see I've put percentages on there. And that's about what proportion of the population is engaged with any given technology or business or other priority. And the reason why I want to do this is I'm going to suggest that fintech, and in fact tech more broadly, is walking perhaps a little unaware into more and more dangerous territory. And the reason for that is we are all, I think, competing for a number of things: attention, resources, capital, talent. And over the last few years, fintech has enjoyed a remarkably, if you like, well-supported journey. It's been something which has enjoyed a huge amount of political support, a huge amount of media support, but I don't think we can take that for granted. And so I thought it would be useful to plot out this graph and explore why. So I'm going to start off by, if you like, explaining the extremes. So let me start off by introducing down here in the bottom left-hand corner, things that don't really matter to anybody very much. They don't appeal to anyone's intellect, and they don't really gather and engage the emotions. So this is your picture of your lunch. Now, I hope you're enjoying it, but I'd be grateful if you didn't share it, because most of us aren't interested. And what you did last summer may fall into this category as well. It may be enormously important to us as individuals. And often, of course, businesses start off solving problems immediate to the founders, but this is not a corner to hang around in. So let's head up to the top left-hand corner here. This is the kind of thing which is really important, but not very exciting for very many people. So I've put energy from fusion here, something which is a technology perhaps 30 years away. And of course, it's always been 30 years away. But if we can get it right, it will have a vast transformative effect on humanity. So it's probably important that we continue to make the case for it. But the case is very much about appealing to the head. This is about winning minds rather more than it is about hearts. And many people, if they stop to think about energy from fusion, will in fact have a rather uncomfortable feeling, if not in their heart, then perhaps in their stomach. But this is something which will perhaps therefore remain very much an elite activity. Now let's head down to the bottom right-hand corner. And what we've got here is that category of things which are enormously emotive to a very high proportion of the population, but probably actually don't provide much impact. Another way of thinking of these axes is to think that the vertical axis is about rates of innovation. And of course, the fishing industry fits into this category. It's a really interesting topical example because although it represents a very small part of the UK economy, it currently has huge leverage. And in fact, the outcomes for the financial services industry may be adversely affected by the interests of an industry which is vastly smaller, perhaps a 20th of the size in terms of contribution to GDP, and yet has a strange place in our hearts, a really powerful fundamental sense that fishing is part of the identity of this island nation. So it's worth being aware of the fact that there are these powerful forces. And I'm going to head up to the top right there and suggest that perhaps what brings both of these together for so many of us now, and I'm bottling everything into the NHS, of course, this is those things that are of enormous emotional importance to us and really engage our brains as well and engage our best researchers and developers. So in this top right category, I suggest we include not just the NHS, but particularly the search for a vaccine. The body of reactions to this unprecedented situation we find ourselves in, including things like the furlough scheme. And so within this frame, I'd like to pause for a minute, invite you to think about where you are. And I'm going to introduce, and forgive the design considerations here, I'm going to introduce the fintech banana. Now, I hope this fits with the lunchy zeitgeist, but the reason why I've chosen a banana is I think it's worth considering that fintech pushes in two directions, but it is in the bottom left-hand corner of this graph. Now, up at the top here, we've got B2B fintech. B2B is heading north on this graph. It's heading up because, of course, it's having a big impact on many, many lives, but it's not really something the public's aware of. Very often, B2B fintech can change many lives because it reaches out through the distribution networks of existing banks and other organizations, but it doesn't really get the attribution. It doesn't get the public engagement. Conversely, of course, B2C is reaching more and more people, and many people will be aware of some of the brands in fintech, particularly challenger banks and consumer brands, but even the biggest of these is still actually less than half the population fully engaged. And so we should be realistic about the fact that those of us who are right at the heart of this activity are suffering from a kind of availability bias, which is not the case for the rest of the country, for most of the people in the UK who are unaware of the contribution that fintech makes to their lives. Now, this may not be a surprise, but the reason it's important to reflect on this now is that the banks are here. And of course, bananas are good for both the head and the heart, but they're also good for gorillas. And critically, gorillas, in the banking sense at least, are much more ready to react to a crisis like this. It's to the incumbent banks that the government, the Treasury in particular, turns in order to make sure that it deploys its financial instruments effectively through the pandemic. And so, of course, this is a time when, if anything, fintech is in danger of being pushed down and to the left in this graph. And that is an existential threat. So that's why fintech needs to change, and change fast. It needs to decide, is this the time for more moonshots? Should we head to the top with product innovation? Should we create the fintech equivalent of fusion energy? Should we go for moonshots, or should we go for magic? Should we head to the right? Should we try to win more hearts? And that's what I'm going to suggest and invite you to consider. I'm going to suggest that right now, at a time when many people are preoccupied by existential questions, many people are preoccupied by their own and their family's health, being bottom left is not a good place to be. And fintech needs to get much smarter about responding to this. But of course, it cannot simply push up and right, because that is already well occupied by the banks. So I'm going to invite you to consider just 2 or 3 examples of organizations, institutions, who we can learn from, and possibly also partner with. So the first of these is cake. Now, everybody loves cake. This is, if you like, the fundamental insight of a spoonful of sugar makes the medicine go down. And so I'm inviting you quite deliberately to aim low for people who are preoccupied by winning appeals to the mind, people who win arguments routinely. I'm going to invite you instead to try to win hearts, and to remember that the mechanisms for doing this are radically less intellectually demanding. They require clarity, they require a bit of sweetness, and cake is perhaps a great metaphor for this. So if you can consider how you can appeal, in the same way perhaps the fishing industry does, to the visceral sense that we have of the familiar. Because when we talk of the heart and public engagement, we're not even necessarily trying to be popular or particularly imaginative. We're seeking to be familiar. Familiarity has enormous value at a time of uncertainty. So greet people with your equivalent of apple pie, cake, a cup of tea, whatever it might be. Down in this bottom right-hand corner, of course, it's worth noting it isn't just fishing boats and cake. It's also a whole range of familiar things. Hooliganism, sport, the royal family. There's plenty here. And I would recommend to every fintech to put aside intellectual focus for a moment and consider how to occupy space down here. But if you want to be a little bit more creative, a bit more intellectually demanding, consider the way the National Lottery engages with more people than any other financial services product in the UK. It brings magic into people's lives. It offers the prospect of transformational upside. Now, of course, it's hugely skewed. Very few people really win big, but everybody gets to hope. And in that kind of magical leverage, I'd suggest there's a lesson for almost every fintech, an opportunity to consider how you make sure, not that you're solving everything for everybody, but that you're thrilling and engaging many more people with a possibility. And perhaps most challenging of all, but most sustainable in the long term, of course, is solving all of the other problems that preoccupy so many of us. And so I've put here the wheel of the Sustainable Development Goals. This is something which, of course, very few fintechs can really talk to all 17 of. But to the extent that you can connect with these global priorities, let alone national ones, you've got a chance of setting yourself as part of something much, much bigger. And that ultimately is the goal here. That, I would suggest, is the best way for fintech to proceed. Spend a little less time perhaps on the moonshots, a little more on the magic, a little more making sure that people who don't think they're interested in fintech become interested in you. Or put another way, rather than expecting everybody to be as excited about what you're doing as you are, this is really a wholehearted invitation to everyone involved in fintech to get better at putting this in ways which appeal to that broad mass of the population who currently feel fintech has nothing for them. This is an invitation to reach out to people who don't think their life will improve as a result of what you do, and to demonstrate in simple, clear, compelling ways, addressed to the heart, that it does. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. That was very good. I'm definitely hungry now. Thank you very much for that. Excellent concept. Loved it. So a couple of things. Do you feel that the good example? So you've got the great minds, and they've come up with this amazing concept or seen a space in the market that's created this company or this new service or whatever it is. So we're looking at the fusion part, and then transitioning across to the very emotional, the heart elements. How's best to do that, especially in a B2B environment, from going from a very as I say, kind of functional mindset into this more of an emotional one?
Well, I guess this is where so many people really struggle. And they struggle because they're trying to move their whole story in this direction. And I guess one of the surprises that I often find people really struggle with is just how little, if you like, technical relevance there needs to be. Put another way, if you try to condense the full story of your product or service into something which is compelling and digestible for, if you like, non-practitioners, people who don't think fintech or maybe tech at all has anything for them, you're setting yourself an impossible task unless you've got a piece of incredibly beautifully designed consumer tech. I am a little bit, I've been given a bigger challenge than I expected. I thought really just here to shock and worry people. But of course, Simon's highlighted I'm actually being asked to present some solutions as well, rather than simply dwell on the challenges facing fintech, turn perhaps to some useful tips and solutions. So I have done something I've never done before. We're really going to struggle to do that. Maybe Apple and a handful of other brands have done it, but with fintech, that's going to be much harder, especially if you have no physical product. So I would say, don't try. Instead, simply take your journey to the right-hand side of that graph and find where you have the most relatable stories to tell. And they don't need to be about your product or service. They need to be about you, why you do what you do, and why it's relevant to things that matter to many more people. There's an organization I know reasonably well called Durham, who some of you may know, who often point out that their business touches on, I think it's 12 out of the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. Now, of course, what they're really doing when they say that is they're pointing out how deeply relevant they are, regardless of whether you use their services, to so much that you may care about. So in other words, don't start with product and try and move across to the right. Start over to the right and say, what are these things here are we relevant to? How can we help people to understand that in primary colors?
Yeah, very much so. I see Dan's just popped up. Dan, I don't know if you want to elaborate on that yourself, but certainly looking at the kind of digital void that I think is probably particularly relevant within the fintech space, right? You've got the early adopters and the kind of financial kind of consumers, I suppose, both in a B2B and B2C situation, but certainly looking at how to bring the other part of the population into these solutions in a way that that they can not engage with, but not be fearful of, I suppose. Do you think that that's kind of one of the hold-ups, the steps that we're seeing resistance on?
Well, I guess Dan's point is spot on. There's a grave danger. Well, it's not a danger; it's happening that this pandemic increases inequality and deepens and widens the digital divide. And again, that's why I would suggest that if what you try to do is tell people about your product or service, and you're in fintech, you're quite likely that a lot of people will remain cold. But of course, if you tell people about why what you're doing, then that can change, because that's not technology dependent. And certainly, for example, I've spent most of the last few months focusing on a project which I know some of you have already been involved in, called Genie Shares, in which we do this. We help entrepreneurs talk not about what they do, but about why they do it, and critically also to share a bit of it. So to use ownership rather than technical capability to bridge that divide, to say, you may not be interested, you may never need the technology that we develop, but we want to make sure our technology works for the whole society, not just its users, its investors, and its employees. And so we're going to put it into people's hands, not necessarily as a service, but as something you own, something you have a stake in. And so I guess when I look to that right-hand side, if you want to consider how to really engage people's hearts as well as their minds, one key variable is a sense of stake, a sense of ownership. And that, of course, doesn't require you to have 5G or even a broadband connection. And tech that gets to the heart cannot do so purely through copper and fiber.
Completely agree there, very much so. I think with that excellent kind of transition, I suppose, of really looking to the emotional side and the consumer itself, and then that would be a good place for us to move over to Clive, and I'm sure we'll be learning a little bit more about how to look at the customer or our customer in a more human fashion. So thank you so much, Ben, and we'll jump back to questions in just a minute after we hear from Clive.
Great, thanks very much. Let me share my screen. Thank you, Ben. Great to see you again. Thank you for your fishing in fintech talk. That was absolutely fabulous. So I'm going to talk to you about design. Well, I wouldn't I? I'm a designer. And obviously I think it's the most important thing, and therefore I've entitled my talk, Design is Not an Option, Design Your Service Experience to Work even. Now, I live in a world which has got even worse, actually, since I joined the Royal College of Art. When I turn up at, let's say, technology conferences or fintech conferences, and I walk on the stage, most people leave immediately, because why is art important? Am I going to do something? And what is design anyway? And when you Google famous designers, you get about 100 fashion designers. Okay, none of which particularly relate to me in terms of how I would interpret design. And even worse, if you put it into your Messenger app, you will see a charming little French style artiste with a brush and a palette. Absolutely extraordinary, really. But you realize the word design has a lot of preconceptions and perceptions that don't necessarily help me in my job of trying to explain that design is a really critical factor in everything we do and everything you do. This came to me through my life as a designer. I've worked for a number of different places, worked a lot of technology companies, and as Simon mentioned in the intro, for Barclays Bank, financial institutions. I worked for Orange at one point, who were really fantastic. If you remember Orange, the mobile operator, now EE, I guess, a long lineage to EE. They were fantastic at branding and fantastic at advertising, communicating the value of their service in a way that really meant something to a customer. And here's an example of an advert. I have email in the palm of my hand, you know, completely simplistic, beautifully simple in terms of describing the value of that technology. Sadly, that was the thing that delivered it. It was unergonomic, it had a tiny screen, and it was just plain ugly. You know, my mum was never going to send an email or a WhatsApp on that machine, even though it had everything that an iPhone now has. So I realized that design was perhaps more important to technology and services than I realized. And we really needed it because it wasn't simply about turning up with lumps of technology like that one. I went on through my career. I worked with Cisco, very much at the sort of underground, the plumbing of technology, and interestingly did a lot of work on gestural interfaces, which is now becoming quite important post-COVID. How can we interface with things through voice and gesture, zero UI, a different way of looking at how we interact with our world. I went on to form a slightly unhappy relationship with technology specifically. Began to see during my career products launched with huge acclaim to be sadly only quite recently gently brushed away under the carpet. The Segway, a tremendous piece of computing power and gyroscopes. It was going to reinvent walking, only it turned out we quite like to walk, especially on cold days. It keeps us warm. Google Glasses, you know, fantastic if you're running a nuclear power station, perhaps, or a brain surgeon. Wear them in the pub, I'll probably punch you. Don't want you to wear that particular thing, please. Now, you know, my wife won't have this in the house. You know, it's a popular thing with some, but when you find out that it's Amazon are developing a service to detect domestic violence, it kind of tells you it is listening all the time. So no, trust stops us. There are lots of emotional reasons why even the most fabulous bits of technology aren't adopted by us, and yet technology still throws it out. Fingers crossed, millions spent. Will people use it? And then they're surprised when they don't. A lot of people talk to me about what I'm going to tell you I do and say, but that's just common sense. To which I respond, well, why don't you do it then? Because these mistakes keep happening. I went on to work in Barclays. Barclays is an interesting and a very interesting technologically led bank. It was often described as a technology company that thought it was a bank, but invented really innovative things like Ping It. Do you remember when you couldn't send money from phone to phone? And then what I loved about Barclays was it did things that all the high up executives said you absolutely couldn't do, like bank on the mobile. A bunch of people in the innovation labs that I joined, as it was called then, you know, decided, well, maybe we could have an app and maybe we just do something simple and then we grow it. And well, now, as you know, I think it's probably about 90% of people are now banking on mobile apps. They also said people would never invest on an app. So we created a responsive website around investment, Smart Investor, that absolutely did work beautifully, and also brought in behavioral finance and was for experts. It was also one of the biggest failures ever. Because of the way it was developed, we designed a beautiful site. 2 years later, something came out that bear very little resemblance to what we had designed. And we realized there was a problem, this lack of connection between our design intent and what actually comes out. The minimum viable product, turns out, wasn't viable in terms of the experience that it delivered. But one of the things I loved about Barclays was the collaborative way of working. And I think this is a strong part of my message to you. Around this table, we have on the far left an HTML developer. We have a bunch of user experience and user interface designers doing visual and wireframing stuff. But we also have the subject matter expert on investments. And we have Pete Brooks, the expert on behavioral finance. And we spent 2 years at that table designing something really, really special. And Design is not something that you just do at the end. It is not lipstick on the pig. It is not perfuming technology to make it acceptable once you've decided how it goes. It has to be at the start, has to be right at the beginning. And I'll tell you a little bit about what that involves. The next thing I did at Barclays was set up a service design team, mainly because it was so to deal with the enormous numbers of complaints. People, businesses, they complained a lot. So we worked through journeys. We created a design process, which is what I want to tell you about, that looked at what was going wrong, not just root cause analysis, not just data, but went beyond that and created solutions to what was going wrong. And we used something that I'd almost forgotten, I nearly invented, but when I was at the Design Council 15 years ago, we did some research on how people design, and we found out there was a pattern that really worked for people. And we created something called the double diamond. It was actually my successor who launched it, but it was my team that did this. And we realized that before you design, before you decide what your solution is, you must understand what's really going on. You discover what is happening. You go and talk to people, you analyze systems, you analyze complaints and data, and then you define, actually, the problem we've got is not what we thought we had. And 9 times out of 10, that is the case. What is the real problem we're trying to solve? And then we can do the things designers are famous for. We can get very creative and have lots and lots of ideas. And finally, we can prepare that for delivery and go and deliver it in an agile way and all that sort of stuff. It's called a diamond because at certain parts in this process, you need to be in a mindset of allowing a lot of ideas or a lot of thoughts, divergent thinking, before we say, okay, that's enough. Now we come down, we focus, because we actually have to do something. And you do that twice in this rhythm. There's lots of people who say it's 3 diamonds. It could be many, but the essence of it is you find out the problem and then you develop a solution. I'm amazed how many people do not do this, which is why I'm here talking to you. Thank you for inviting me, Simon. At the beginning of this, it's all about finding out what's really going on. And you can have data, of course, but going and talking to people, I was amazed how few people talk to their customers, whether it's a consumer or a business. Have you really talked, or are you just listening to somebody from marketing or sales? We need to go and actually listen to what they're saying. We need to show them what our proposition is. But when we do that, we really discover what's going on. And we compile those discoveries as journeys. What is the journey? And of course, the journey is not necessarily what we think about it as the only interaction with your company, with business to coming and using what you're developing. It goes much before that. It goes much after it. I always talk about journeys as, I wrote a book once, nearly 20 years ago. It's on Amazon. Amazon's a brilliant thing. Amazon's got a big warehouse. When you buy the book, robots and stuff happens, and they send it to you, and you can track it. Little vans rush around, and the ubiquitous in time of pandemic. DPD person arrives at your door, except my door is, of course, a letterbox. Now, pre-COVID, this meant my Saturday was queuing up at Wimbledon Post Office, just picking up all this stuff that was delivered when I wasn't there. So there was a big problem. It's much easier in COVID. I'm here more often than not now. But suddenly we have to create click and collects, and Amazon have to buy Deliveroo because they realize it's all about the last few yards. And anytime soon, I'm going to have drones landing on my back lawn. So the journey is always much more complex and beyond any part of those quite brilliant little components. And I think we always forget that. And I love that the post office is now creating post boxes to send stuff back when you don't want it or it doesn't fit. So in service design, we use a framework. This is a fast talk, so you'll get the picture about how do people choose you. We might normally call that marketing, but it can be design. Is something attractive? And what are the touch points for that? How do you join or purchase? How do you use? We usually put all our design effort there and not across the journey. How do we keep people? How do we grow and retain? How do we turn them into advocates? And having that much bigger picture of what your business is about. Have you talked to people to understand why they chose you? How are they engaging with you? Is it easy? Have you lived your own experience? Have you done a service safari on your business? Not knowing anything about it, putting that knowledge to one side and understand what it's like. We did that for financial transactions at Barclays, and my goodness, we found some interesting things. This is a journey map that talks about how does a customer find out, in this case, a money transfer process. How do they choose it? How do they know it exists? How do they get engaged with it, interact? What is the process? And in this particular case, what is the waiting time? So you know that your money has gone from you to wherever you're sending it internationally. As you can see, we ended up putting it together with bits of string. It's the customer, it's the bank, it's people, it's systems, it's data, including a massive big black hole where for 2 days, nobody in the world knew what happened to your money. It's much better now. But this kind of visualization of a journey is such a powerful tool. It's so powerful, executives went and took it down because they didn't want people to see it. Which tells you a lot. This is such a powerful tool, and you should do this with your business right now after this talk. What's that journey like for you? And then, of course, the point about this is understanding pain points or understanding opportunities is to have lots of ideas. And creativity is not about sitting on a mountaintop. It's about collaborating with all your people, having brainstormings, lots of great things you can learn from Google Sprint book, Crazy Eights. Have loads of ideas, share them, talk about them, vote on them, come down till you've got the 2 or 3 you want, and then you validate and you test them. And design, again, is about faking it until you make it. This is a fake site for a pension dashboard to help understand whether people wanted it. We matched people in a user testing group with data, and we saw the realization in their faces that they didn't have enough money in their pensions. And we turned that round, showed it to the pension industry and shamed them into sharing their data and creating a pension dashboard, which maybe some of you know is hopefully going to go live pretty soon. I keep hearing rumors that it's about to happen. And press a button, find all your pensions. And another really interesting thing we did was we made the advert at the start of the project. Because by doing that, we can show it to ourselves and to others and say, do you want this? And if people say no, don't build it, right? Change it, iterate it, find out what they do want before you waste all those dollars, yens, pounds, whatever you've got in your euro, whatever. These are simple things. As I say, it's common sense, isn't it? But nobody does it. Absolutely nobody does it. I went on afterwards, just a couple of reflections and stories to finish off. I went on to work in a digital identity world, to using blockchain, and suddenly I realized that there's a whole new wave of technology you probably are very, very aware of around things like blockchain and AI. And of course, we live in a world now where our health will come to us from AI. So who's making the decisions there? Who's programming AI? We know that in areas of, let's say, vulnerable customers, we're working on projects where AI is helping discover people in vulnerable circumstances, but it's also putting people in prison, especially in the US. So there's bias in these systems that we, as a human design action, need to understand and be careful of. And of course, wonderfully, the algorithm became a thing in the UK around the UK exams a couple of months ago, when suddenly everyone got rather unpleasant exam results because the algorithm had said it, as if it was something from Mars that had arrived. Of course, it's a humanly programmed thing. The world is humanly programmed. In fact, it's humanly designed. And as we design it, we need to build in affordance, which is one of my favorite words at the moment, where, when you do something, this is showing a little digital card on a phone. So we're representing the physical, and maybe this thing goes bing, and the person having the transaction, we all have confirmations and we understand the system. So we mustn't forget to design in what we call in our world affordances to help people understand, and you understand what's going on, even though it's magical and invisible and automated in the world of AI and blockchain. My first boss, Bill Mogridge, famous for designing this thing, the world's first laptop, not a success at all because the operating system was wrong. But he said to me, few people think about it or are aware of it. There is nothing made by human beings that does not involve a design decision somewhere. And I've extrapolated that because I realize that all the decisions you make every day, if it has an impact on the business or customer or consumer you are aiming to use your business, then it's a design decision. All right. And it's not something, you don't ring up a design consultant, you're part of that. Designers are brilliant facilitators to help you do that. And here's a great example right at the end. I joined a project at Barclays that was about fraud and crime, financial crime, trying to create a platform that could in real time and with AI predict the likelihood of crime. After an 8-week sprint, the data team came back and said, we've done it. We've got all that data. We've done it. Yee, open the champagne. We can see in real time crime. And we said, where is it? And they said, what do you mean, where is it? And we said, well, what's the output of this knowledge from this data? And they said, an email. And we asked, how many emails are there? And they said, about 16,000 a day. This was not a data problem. Data had solved something. This was a data visualization problem. And we had to design a way that everybody, from an investigator to a head of a business unit to the CEO who's got his Apple Watch on, he needs to get, or she needs to get that alert saying, game's up, the fraudsters have won, your bank's about to close, call the Prime Minister, whatever it might be. It was a design project. And at the RCA service design course, we take on sticky problems like that. And you'll see in our recent graduates, projects on data, helping you understand your data, projects using data with people like Visa to create new behavior, get people walking to work, and using local businesses with reward schemes. Creative, imaginative solutions to sticky little problems that either we knew we had or opportunities we didn't know we had. Projects on green investment, on teaching children, on new millennial wealth, ways of understanding your credit score. Lots and lots of great ideas at rcaservicedesign.com. Advert over. Design methods reduce the risk for your companies because you prototype, you find out whether they're wrong early. It makes complex systems easy to use. It's not a luxury. You're designing every day, you just didn't realize it. Thanks for your time.
Clive, fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. Excellent insights there. And I see that we've got a few questions here. And I noticed, and maybe I'll bring Tracy in here because she mentioned about having done this at her work, which was, I believe, in reference to the customer journey. I'm just curious from my own standpoint, obviously, when you're looking at the wealth of individuals that were involved in that, obviously, you mentioned marketing, you've also got, customer service, you've probably got, development and also sales maybe. And then, even from my world, at SGK being an agency, it might even be a third party entity that are involved in those kind of things. So typically in most companies, you tend to find these things are siloed off.
Yes.
So how did you do that? And maybe as well, Tracy, how did you get around all of those entities and get them?
It's a really good question. And it's kind of the most important point that I think when you do a journey map, you have a message for almost everybody in the company. And we always say service designers are more curious than anyone normally is, but they're also courageous because they can come back to you. And like that wall chart I showed you, it takes a bit of guts to show that to people, but they need to know. You need to follow it up quick with what we can now do is collaborate. And it's that collaboration to break down those silos. And we use that journey map and then some other techniques as well, to show who customers really are so that everybody has a shared understanding and everyone understands their journey and their role in it and how they can improve that journey. And that forges collaboration. It forges a happier company, actually. But people realize that just because your bit is brilliant, if another bit is crap, you're all crap, and we all know that from our own experience, what I call my Saturday morning hat, when I'm buying something and it goes wrong and I shout down the phone to a call center or whatever it is. We actually all know very well what a great experience is, but when we go to work on a Monday, we tend to forget it and just think operationally and internally. This is a tool, I think, that encourages collaboration, encourages a single view of the customer. And so everyone knows what the right decision is when they understand the customer and what you're trying to do and the loyalty you're trying to build. So I think it's a more powerful tool than simply getting it right. It really helps people understand what they can do. I just spot in the chat, actually, a couple of nice things. I'm glad people are using the double diamond. I will just quickly answer Dan's question. Software using digital whiteboards. We are doing that all the time, I have to say, and using these design processes to take software teams. What we find is people's tendency is to code first and then find out if it works second. So what we do is we turn that round and say, let's just imagine what this is going to be and understand whether it works, like making the advert first, like mocking up. And digital is so easy to mock up total journeys like we did on the pension dashboard. And then you can go coding, you can have loads of fun, make it brilliant, by all means, go agile. But we're quite poor, especially in the software world, at actually just pausing. You know, we have teams saying we need to be coding now. What are you coding? You know, we need to all collectively know who the user is, know what the journey is, know what our vision is, if you like. And then, my goodness, we can go and be creative and go mad and code away and create amazing things. Always coming back and testing. Always testing to check we're doing the right thing. So when you press go on launch day, you can sleep better the night before, because you know your risk is much less. You've tested it, you've seen it, people have seen it and got it, and you know you're going to be 90% okay. I hope that makes sense.
Very much so. While see if anyone else has any questions, but I had another one. Okay, so you go through this process. What is the kind of frequency of which you recommend that companies go through this? Obviously, you know, you may have gone through this process, you know, for instance, like last year, and then, you know, it's an extreme example, but obviously this year, an awful lot has happened, and what worked last year might be dramatically different to
Correct. Yes.
So is it what kind of sorts of things do you think trigger the need to revisit these?
Again, another excellent question, Simon. Thank you. I think a lot of people think design is something that only happens with a blank piece of paper at the beginning of a startup or beginning of a new idea or a project. You know, funnily enough, at Barclays, 99% of what we did, and I tell this to my students, they will be spending most of their lives fixing the basics. And the triggers for most of my life have been something's wrong. You know, we've got something live, but we start this process to understand exactly what is wrong. You know, we can have lots of complaints data or NPS scores that are low. But that data doesn't help you enough until you really dig down. So you start this process when you have a problem and something isn't working, or just as you say, things might have been working fine until this new environment arises. And you have to go back and say, what is going on? But you need to be courageous enough to find the real problem and solve that problem, and not allow people, even if it's the CEO, to say, trust me, I know what this is. You don't. You haven't spoken to the customers, business customers, consumers, whoever it is. If you've done that, and then you say, right, you know, we've got 3 possible things this might be, and there's a sense of early on trying some different things, not just one thing. CEOs and politicians have an idea. They're so delighted and they protect it and they run from one end of the pitch to the other, and then they get there and plant the ball down, and it's the wrong solution for the wrong problem, and it's all rather embarrassing and expensive. This is what we're trying to prevent. We're trying to help at any point in your project or your ongoing service experience. You can do this and understand quickly. And this is not always about solving problems either. I think we always forget to say, well, actually, is there an opportunity here? There's some new technology coming in. You know, is there something? How well would it be? And in my experience, people of all ilk are very bad at understanding what the application of technology really is. Now, this process says, let's try a few things out very early, very quickly, prototypey, you know, fast. Let's find out whether this is likely. What's the propensity for this to scale up and be a big success? You know, and the alternative is just blindly running. So why wouldn't you do this?
Yeah,
lots of people saying they agree with me, which I'm sort of upset about, because I like preaching to people who don't get it. But I'm delighted you know what I'm talking about.
So say what close some great things there, and definitely with the testing. Do you feel certainly, you know, you mentioned that the double diamond approach, which I believe was probably defined around physical products, or a time when that was the norm, which obviously the cost of getting a physical product release wrong is very expensive, whereas in the digital realm, you know, it's pretty easy just to go repatch something and things like that.
Absolutely.
That's created a lazy.
Yes, I do. I think lazy is the right word, actually. I mean, you're right. You know, you can sort of quickly A/B test something and find out whether that button should be red or blue. But I think that the difficulty UX has had, first of all, is that most problems are not just the app or the digital interface. You know, most of the problems at the big bank were because somebody had written a risk rule or a policy rule 20 years ago and forgotten to ever change it, you know, and it caused a huge amount of pain, and no amount of coding or app development would solve it, actually. So I think one of the things we say is to stand back and look at the real problem again. But it's great that digital gives us that chance to quickly prototype. But I think if we just sort of prototype the color of a button all the time, or divide everything into little tiny use cases, it reduces the opportunity for us to stand back and say, what are the big opportunities here? Could we do something dramatically simply? And again, I remember being back at Orange, and when we moved into the digital world, you know, every single function was repeated on a digital or a website or whatever. It turned out that only about 20% of that was ever used, because people only wanted to do certain things online. And if we'd done that research first, it would have saved us a hell of a lot of money. And we'd have got to market much quicker by simply understanding what people did want to do. And even in this much more sort of digital usability world, we still forget to understand whether people even know what this thing exists or understand its purpose. And my phone is full of apps that I don't use, you know. So, and it almost comes back to Ben's talk, actually. You know, how do we win the hearts and minds? You know, it's part of that journey. How do you tell people you've got something that they just cannot live without? That's as important as doing the UX on the buttons and the screen flows, you know. So I think just thinking a little bit more holistically is one of the messages that I think this double diamond is not a religion, but it's just, I think, a very important reordering of what people normally do, to make you pause and say, hang on, you know, let's check we're going on the right road. We can go along the wrong road at 500 miles an hour, but we're being very much the wrong destination at the end. When we're at that crossroads, let's understand which road is most likely, because we can talk to people and see what happens and prototype and pilot and get them in.
Very much so. I see Dan's got a dream here of telcos and banks to fully and openly collaborate. Are you heading down the kind of Chinese super app kind of situation where, you know, you can do everything from buying your health insurance through to your banking, through to ordering pizza, through your WeChat app or Yeah.
Well, that is very interesting. I mean, there's two things there. I mean, yes, that is possibly the case in terms of, you know, one button for everything, and we're seeing everyone racing to do that. One of the experiences I did have at Barclays was how difficult it was. I mean, Barclays has been a great promoter of fintech with its RISE organization, and that was very good. And I used to spend quite a lot of time down there with startups who didn't think about any of this stuff. You know, they had their very, very brilliant minds on something, you know, one particular pain point. They weren't particularly good at understanding how customers might understand it and use it and see it and become loyal to it. But I think also what was really bad was the mechanisms. Barclays and other banks are very poor at like just doing brave little experiments, because they slap the whole of compliance and legislation on the tiniest little pilot, and it's just impossible to do it. And so it was very difficult to test out some really brilliant ideas. You know, so it's, you know, they just go and buy them, I guess, and that's happening to some extent. But we do need more shared platforms that allow smaller companies to interact with banks. There's some particularly, as you all know, some very specific issues around security and you know, and sharing the kind of investment that Barclays put in to do that anti-crime fraud thing. That was a massive project, you know, and a little tiny company can't do that. So how do you keep the security chain going through all these different partners coming? There are some real problems. I saw that, but at the same time, I think we need some better solutions to really help small companies, because big companies are not great, even though there are some great examples of intrapreneurs. You know, we need to find some patterns that really work to get that innovation into the bigger companies, or everyone gets frustrated and they go and start their Monzos and Revoluts and all that stuff, and take them on that way. But there should be more. There should be better. Can I answer that question? Where we're seeing tech rushing to do that with one button. The real issue here is the linked data and the lack of it. Right. Oh my goodness. I could have done a whole talk on data. So obviously the problem with data is trust. We have the same problem in healthcare right now. Though COVID is sort of encouraging people to get used to the idea that data is shared automatically. And I think you're absolutely right, you know, one button. So doing the one button pension dashboard, for example, meant that we had to design that very carefully to trust it and to check you were the right identity and that data really was yours and the data really was there. So it's a much more complex thing than having one button. You're absolutely right. And, you know, and the other thing is that people get very tribal about who's got the button. If it's an Amazon button or a WeChat button or a WhatsApp button or an Apple button or a Google button, you know, about 4 of those brands I wouldn't go near. So very emotional things. You know, if you go and see talks on finance and leadership and all that stuff, we all know that bank decisions are not made on data. They're made entirely on emotions, and so are customer decisions. So I think, again, this idea that the things that we care about, like empathy and listening and trying to understand what people are really doing, combined with the data. But if people turn off the data, don't give you permission to give you data, and that was the work I was doing on digital identity, how do you help people be comfortable with giving permission to people to get a better customer experience? If you fail on that, then a lot of stuff falls away and it's useless. So that's I haven't got the answers to that yet. I mean, I'm asking my students that very question. How do services depend on data, giving you personalized, amazing experiences? But if people don't like that, we're in trouble.
Yeah, I'd imagine that the students are probably some of the more trusting, I suppose, of data as you move maybe a little bit up the spectrum. You'd get a lack of trust maybe as people get older. You know, they're used to the more traditional ways of.
Yes and no. Yes and no. You're right. They'll sell their soul for a freebie on a website, but and you click yes to everything. But at the same time, you know, philosophically, they're very aggressive against the big bad world, you know, of Google and data and what it might be spying on me about. So there's a kind of a weird mixture, actually. Makes them quite good guinea pigs.
Yeah. Well, we've got 3 minutes to go, so let me just jump in. I want to thank you all for being here and you know, enjoying this lunchtime with us. A huge thanks to Clive and Ben for sharing some tremendous insights with us. And this, as I say, is recorded, so we are going to go ahead and send this out to everyone. So you know, keep an eye open for that on your inboxes. And you know, just a big round of applause, guys. Thank you so much, and you know, look forward to seeing you all and speaking again soon.
Thanks, Scott. Great chats as well. Thanks for all the things there. I think I agree with all of them. Brilliant. Thank you very much, Simon.
Thank you all.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye now.